Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Friday, August 12th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. We're officially 3 weeks away from the show's release, and you can feel the excitement building. As for this podcast, we're back with our second ever guest to discuss all things Númenor. Joining me for today's episode is Erran, better known on Tolkien Twitter as Lesbians For Boromir. Not only is Erran incredibly incisive and very funny, but they also have a knack for holding somewhat unique and even unpopular opinions, which is always refreshing. But I knew if I was going to have anyone on the podcast to rave about Númenor with me, it would have to be the number one defender of Denethor and the champion of Anarion. This will be an extra long episode, but I've decided to publish it in one part, so I hope you enjoy the in-depth discussion. We must always start an episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today's reading was chosen by Erran and comes from The Lord of the Rings, Book 5, The Pyre of Denethor. "Since when has the Lord of Gondor been answerable to thee?" said Denethor. "Or may I not command my own servants?" "You may," said Gandalf, "but others may contest your will when it is turned to madness and evil. Where is your son, Faramir?" "He lies within," said Denethor. "Burning, already burning. They have set a fire in his flesh, but soon all shall be burned. The west has failed. It shall all go up in a great fire, and all shall be ended. Ash and smoke blown away on the wind." Then Gandalf, seeing the madness that was on him, feared that he had already done some evil deed, and he thrust forward with Beregond and Pippin behind him, while Denethor gave back until he stood beside the table within. But there they found Faramir still dreaming in his fever, lying upon the table. Wood was piled upon it and high all about it, and all was drenched with oil, even the garments of Faramir and the coverlets, but as yet no fire had been set to the fuel. Then Gandalf revealed the strength that lay hid in him, even as the light of his power was hidden under his grey mantle. He leapt up onto the faggots, and raising the sick man lightly, he sprang down again and bore him towards the door. But as he did so, Faramir moaned and called on his father in his dream. Denethor started as one waking from a trance, and the flame died in his eyes, and he wept, and he said, "Do not take my son from me. He calls for me." "He calls," said Gandalf, "but you cannot come to him yet, for he must seek healing on the threshold of death, and maybe find it not, whereas your part is to go out to the battle of your city, where maybe death awaits you. This you know in your heart." "He will not wake again," said Denethor. "Battle is vain. Why should we wish to live longer? Why should we not go to death side by side?" "Authority is not given to you, steward of Gondor, to order the hour of your death," answered Gandalf. "And only the heathen kings under the domination of the dark power did thus, slaying themselves in pride and despair, murdering their kin to ease their own death." Then, passing the door, he took Faramir from the deadly house, and laid him on the bier on which he had been brought, and which had now been set in the porch. Denethor followed him, and stood trembling, looking with longing on the face of his son. And for a moment, while all were silent and still, watching the Lord in his throes, he wavered. Thank you, Erran, for that beautiful passage. And as you're about to hear, we discuss a lot of the themes set forth in this scene, so it is very fitting. But without any further delay, let's get into the discussion. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the show none other than Erran, Lesbians For Boromir. How are you doing today?
I am, as I said, hot, but I'm doing basically great. I'm doing great. Thanks, Harry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Equally, we're both stuck in the melting hellhole that is England at the moment. So probably about the same as you. Yeah. So Before we get started talking about all your specialist subjects, which I'm sure no one will be surprised what they are if they follow you on Twitter, how about we start in tried and true Tolkien podcast fashion? If you tell the audience here how exactly it is you got into Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and all of it. When and where did you fall down this terrible path?
Well, obviously from a very young age. It's my mother is the one who introduced me to Lord of the Rings. It was one of her favored books. She got all of the books when she was very young, actually, and then I actually still have the books that she got when she was young. So I've got these sort of falling apart, rotting books that are in right next to me, actually, right now. But so she read them to me, and she read them to me multiple times. She read me the Hobbit, and then of course the films came out, and the films had an interesting effect on my attachment to Tolkien. Certainly, I was already very attached to the books, even as a child, but obviously, like, the sudden influx of interest to them really garnered my excitement, and especially with my mother as well. So we would talk all the time about Tolkien when I was young, and we still do. It annoys my father immensely. But obviously, as I grew up, I reread the books, and again, if anyone follows me on my Twitter, it would not be a surprise to say that quite rapidly my affection for the films became, let's say, complicated. A complicated relationship between me and Peter Jackson specifically, and the whole.
That's one way to put it.
It's one way to put it, yes, and it's the most polite way. And since I'm on your podcast, I will remain as polite as possible.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure we'll have time to get some sly Peter Jackson digs in there. I promise I won't censor them as long as they're PG, rather than PJ. Now that we've talked about how you got into Tolkien, one of the things I'm wondering about, because I've obviously listened to you on other podcasts and I've followed you on Twitter for a while, what's your journey been like over the last year or so with the show, as we've, went from having basically no information, a couple of maps and then one teaser image to now, well, God, we're now at 4 trailers and several teasers and 1 million posters. How's your journey been with the show?
Yeah, there's so many. Well, I mean, interestingly, like, because I've been very involved, not necessarily verbally, but very involved in the whole Lord of the Rings community for quite many years now. It's been a long time, and actually the Tolkien Society, they were doing their paper readings and seminars and stuff. So that was getting me into the Lord of the Rings community a lot. So actually, I heard about it when we were still thinking that it was going to be an Aragorn backstory series, where it was going to be Aragorn as a young man. Yeah, there was this really old, really ancient leak that it was going to be about this, and it was actually before they even revealed that they bought the rights to it at all. There was this leak that it was going to be about Aragorn, and that later continued all the way up until they actually released those.
The hand posters, or was it the maps?
Maps, like on the Amazon. There was the maps, yeah, the maps. I think because the maps were very distinctively of not Third Age Middle Earth, like Khazad-dûm was still called Khazad-dûm, Lauraland was still called Laurelin Dorinan or something like that. It was, so all the names were still there. Also, it was still forested on one of them, and etc. etc. And that was the first realization that we all had, that it was even going to be of the Second Age. And I cannot tell you how relieved I was. I was oh, thank goodness. It's not going to even feature Denethor. I don't even have to worry about this. This isn't even going to be my wheelhouse. I can just sit back and not care, as a lot of elf fans get really upset about all of the elf representation. And then they revealed that it was going to have Isildur and it was going to have Elendil, and I did now have to care about it, and I was very distraught. And then it all went. So the peaks and troughs, I have to say, a massive trough when I thought it was going to be about Aragorn, and then they released all of the images of ships, and now I'm thinking, oh no, I actually care about this show. Like I am invested fully into it. I'm incredibly excited about how they're going to take these characters and what way they're going to develop them. The philosophy, the philosophy. I can't even begin to start talking about the philosophy yet. And admit that there was a weird like middle neutral point of my affection and interest in this show when they released all the posters. And we were all getting really excited about the posters. Like, everyone was talking about the lettering on Gil-galad's crossbar of a costume, and they hadn't like told us what those characters even were. Like, we had to still guess who they were in the first place. So that was quite fun. And we got them all wrong as well, except for a few. We got most of them wrong, though, and I think that was kind of the moment where I first felt most neutral, I would say, about the show, because with those posters, there was this sensation that when a lot of our like thinking and looking at it and stuff was kind of unnecessary, it didn't really pan out to be anything, because all of the characters are very unique and they're doing lots of other stuff. It kind of didn't feel like it was going to be for the hard fans. But then suddenly we've had all of this influx of all of these really interesting ideas from all these actors, these really in-depth understandings about the lore itself and about the inspirations for them. Lloyd Owen I am particularly impressed by, and now I'm impressed by Tristan Gravel as well, so I'm riding high now.
Yeah,
so,
no, I think what's interesting is you've probably gone on the same journey a lot of fans have, where it went from kind of, ooh, they're making a show. I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I still remember when my friend first texted me years ago showing me, and I said, oh, God, what are they going to do with this? Because I was still, while there were parts of the Hobbit films I liked, I was still kind of like, oh, I was thinking, I hope it's something new and fresh and different. And then I thought, well, Amazon's bought it, so if they're buying it, they must be wanting to redo the films, because why else would they spend all this money? And then, like you say, we got the characters, we got the maps, which was kind of like, okay, that's weird, Numenor's on it, but, it would be, what are they going to do then? But they've also got the rest of the map, so it's not just a Numenor story. And I think what was funny is, now that you mentioned it, when the character posters came out, and as you said, we all had lots of guesses, and the two that everyone was certain about was Gil-galad's poster. Everyone was certain was Celebrimbor, because he's wearing like 8 rings, he's clad in gold, it's very Feanorian kind of drama wear. And then the other one that everyone was really sure about was Elendil's poster, because there was a sword, there was like 3 different suns on the picture, and everyone was like, oh, my boy Anarion, you have returned to the silver screen. And everyone got their hopes up for a few weeks until they were brutally dashed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was, for me, it was the Elrond reveal, because I looked at that and I said, oh, that's, a lot of my friends as well, we were like, oh, Tar Palantir, that must be, because he's holding this like scepter, and scepter to me immediately is it is the sigil of royalty in most of Arnorian, at least, history. So I was like, the sigil of the king, a steward maybe. I was very excited, but no, apparently it's Elrond, and I'm still not sure about that scepter. Still don't know about that one, but
yeah, it's an interesting one. There's lots of things that I think that now I understand why they went with for the posters. There's still some things I'm not quite sure about. Celebrimbor's scroll I still find particularly strange, given that from what I think we've heard, that Eregion is already founded, so it doesn't sound like he's building a new city, but maybe this is just some design for some craft. I think the Elrond one I've kind of come around to. I've heard from Fellowship of Fans that the city on top is meant to be Gondolin's, so maybe it's just a family heirloom that somehow escaped the sack, but you never know really at this point. And
still very odd.
Yeah, it is very odd, but as anyone who follows me on Twitter will know, I've just been completely won over by Robert Aramayo, so I'm in for it now, and whatever the staff is or the scepter, I'm just going to accept it and go with it. Turning to the point of today's show, what after we've meandered for a few minutes discussing our kind of both our origins and our journey to today, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was because we went from, despite the first 2/3 of the marketing campaign, having nothing at all on Numenor, not a sight of a character, not a location, not a nothing, with the exception of the initial shot from the Super Bowl teaser where we saw the ship sailing in and we all kind of correctly guessed that was Numenor. We didn't have anything for months. And then we finally got that Entertainment Weekly article where we got all the characters and the costumes and some stills. Now, I remember hearing you on a podcast when this was released, and you said about how that had kind of really reignited your excitement about it. What was it about those first images and characters and costumes and everything that you saw in those kind of first releases of Numenor? What was it that really kind of got your attention there? I'm interested.
Well, I think it was really the attention to, not just, I don't want to say attention to detail, because it's kind of more than that. It's attention to culture. It's attention to a living, breathing, functioning royalist theocracy. It's such a complicated place, Numenor, and it has so much history to it. I was just so enamored by their imagination, I suppose, but also just surrounding what we were given about Numenor. Just the way that they just honed in on this golden and blue aesthetic. Firstly, really inspired me. It looked so correct. It looked so right. I also was really fond of the way they had avoided this kind of let's go with Minas Tirith-esque kind of bland whiteness with which was really only this kind of fantasy Middle Ages somewhere Europe idea that is it's such a boring image to me, and and they really avoided it. It now has they have like vaulted marbled pillars that hold up, and the blue marble and the gold filigree and all of these actually, you know what, it was the bridge. The first shot of one of the first like trailers we ever got was us coming over the bridge that leads into, I think it's going to be Andunii, and it has this sun symbol in the center of it. But the longer I looked at it, the more I found these intricate like pattern details that covered the whole lot of it with these flowers and stars and suns, and I was like, oh, it's Nimloth's flower, it's the star of Elendil, Elendil, and the sun, obviously, Aure Entaluva, Huron, like, and the sea imagery. I was just so it was right to me. It was like, and it wasn't necessarily exactly how I would have portrayed it, but also I just felt like there was a care for who these people were, a care about how they lived and what motivates them, what the actual society is about, which I never got when Gondor was first expressed or shown on Peter Jackson's. You really get nothing about who Gondor is.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about that, and I talked about this a few weeks ago, was that one of the things I've really liked, and I made a joke about this, was that line in I think it was the teaser trailer, where the Harfoot character says, you know, elves have their forests, dwarves have their mines, and then they said men have their fields of grain. And at first I was like, wow, really selling the men short here. But then I had that moment of being like, but yeah, of course, because, you know, men have these kingdoms, they need to feed them, their villages, their people, their community. And it was one of those moments where I kind of went back to, maybe different to you, but I quite enjoyed the Peter Jackson films. But I did have that whole sense, especially in Gondor. Rohan there was maybe a little bit more through the scenes of the burning of the Westfold, but with Gondor you never got that sense that anyone lived there, or you were like, how are they living there? Because there's this big one city, and there's Osgiliath that looks like, you know, kind of, I know they were kind of channeling Stalingrad in kind of World War II, but there was this sense of like, I have literally no idea how or where anyone lives in Gondor. And I remember reading that Entertainment Weekly article, and we talked about this at the time, when the production designer was talking about the fact that you could wander down the streets and there were little shrines, whether it's to the Valar or to Númenor heroes, and then there was graffiti on them against the elves. And there was just this sense that not only had they built a set that made sense, but then they'd layered it with all this history, which I expected a lot, but even for me, that was something else, I think.
You can't mention the Numenorian graffiti without me getting... I can't even think about the Numenorian graffiti. I can't even think about it. I mean, yes, exactly. I mean, the issue I've always had with the Peter Jackson films is I do know how Gondor works. Like, I know how these people live. I know what their political situation, what their philosophical talking is about. I know the current social discourse. I know these things about Gondor, and they were just so absent from anything I saw in Peter Jackson's film. And that's the thing. That's actually a really good point, because yes, whilst I'm not as... I don't know as much as I do about Gondor, about Numenor, but things like Numenoran graffiti, which is graffiti of Adunaic language over the top of Elven writing, is such a wonderful little snippet of the wider understanding of the kind of social discourse that is going through Numenor at the time. And actually, I guess we'll talk about it later, but this is backed up majorly by Tristan Gravel's recent article about his character and Pharazon's things and stuff. The kind of acceptance and embracing of where Numenor is as a society without a kind of a really overwhelming moralization of that, I think, is what I'm really excited about it sounding like. The allowance for Numenor to be asking these questions and to be having these discussions, which are, Kingsmen versus the faithful, elves versus human priorities, and the way that the graffiti just amplifies that in such a small way. Beautiful. The little shrines could be a wonderful example of what I've always imagined as a kind of saint worship of the Valar, which is almost not allowed in Numenor. If we talk about Numenorian religion and Numenorian religious rites and things like that, really the queen or the king should only be the one who is a priest, and really nobody should be worshipped except for maybe Eru. I've always been excited about the idea of there being break-off kind of faiths that involve the Valar in unique ways that might not be socially acceptable by and large, but are kind of more in the small cultural places in different places in Numenor.
That was great. But also, you kind of reminded me of something when you said about how through the set design, through these details, they're able to tell, I suppose, the socio-political story of Numenor. And what's interesting is that I remember back when we found out about the time compression, a big maybe concern is the better word than complaint, because we knew very little at the time, was that how do you show the rise and fall of Numenor if you're only going to do one lifetime, right? Because wherever you place that lifetime, fundamentally you are therefore either putting it, somewhere in the middle or towards the end of Numenor's kind of decline. And one of the really interesting things I remember hearing Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, say when he spoke to the showrunners in London was that when asked about this whole idea of how do you show Numenor, like how do you show what it meant, the showrunners said something along the lines of, and I don't remember the exact wording that Corey put it, was that if you say that you can't show in one lifetime what it meant to have the downfall of Numenor, then what you're effectively saying is Elendil didn't know what it meant, or Pharazon didn't know what it meant, or Miriel didn't know what it meant. Yes, we can't show the 23 or however many kings and queens of Numenor there was, but what we can do is we can show what it meant to be living in a society that maybe still thinks it's in its golden age, but is actually rapidly approaching the cliff's edge, and is perhaps even moving faster and faster towards the cliff's edge. And so having things like the graffiti over the elven shrines, having things like, we're going to get into these guilds later, but the kind of the ascendancy of a merchant class over perhaps a royal class, and the emphasis of Numenor's economic and political status over its, perhaps you could even use the word spiritual or diplomatic status to the elves, is a really interesting one. And I think, as we've heard from the characters, it's definitely something the show's going to explore, whether through dialogue, set design, costume design, all these things. I think they're going to attempt to show us what that history looks like if you'd lived through it and were living through the tail end of it.
Yeah, I agree entirely. That that's exactly what I think. And the time compression I'm still grieving about, most particularly because I'm grieving for Tar Telperion. I'm so sorry. She had such an intriguing position in the historical situation as being at the kind of the start of where all of this struggle and all of this faith religious conflict comes from, and you could have designed such an interesting development across her lifetime if you'd gone with her. But I find that one of the most interesting sections of the history of Numenor, but I'll let it go, because I do agree. I do understand entirely, it's very hard to have started a show 2,000 years before the final actual end point of how this whole situation, and it's especially the Last Alliance is so climactic as well. It's such a climactic moment for everybody that I do understand. I suppose I'm still a little bit intrigued about. I also understand why they brought forward Celebrimbor and the Rings, but I'm not. It's difficult for me to understand then how Numenor got to this point if we are then accepting that this is kind of the first time that humans have had to go to war for elves in this age. Not that it's the first time that they've had to go to war for elves per se in the world, but still, Numenor has never had to do this. But that's what happened with Tar Telperion. They went to war for elves. Many of them must have died, and then many of them must have come home asking, why did we do that? Why did we spend our lives, our short lives that are finite, for these elves who, even if they die, are still just going to respawn in Valinor anyway eventually? So how did we, philosophically speaking, morally speaking, how do we accept that is the sacrifice that we are making when the elves would never kind of do the same thing for us? So, and that has been lost.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well, because I think about as well so for any listeners who perhaps haven't got the history of Numenor and the 24, 25 kings and queens memorized, we have this point around the middle of the Second Age where Sauron first invades and the Númenóreans go to war because Gil-galad asks for their help, and they come and they defeat Sauron, and Sauron's driven back, basically licking his wounds for another 1,000 or however many years it is. It might be 1,500. But what then happens in the centuries following that is that you first start to get Númenóreans occupying lands in Middle-earth. You get the first monarchs who are speaking against the Banner of the Valar. You start to get this breakdown between the king's men and the faithful, and then you have that percolate, I guess, back and forth for a good 1,000 years. So we're definitely missing the slow burn of it, and I'm very interested to see, and maybe we will move on to this next. I think the way they're going to show that is through this kind of this dichotomy of Miriel and Pharazon. And I think while we'll get onto the House of Elendil later because we have a lot to say there, but just sticking with Pharazon and Miriel, I think there's a really interesting way in that rather than have it be a 1,000-year debate, it's a debate that takes place in one lifetime between the two most powerful people in Numenor. And I think as the argument tips in, obviously Pharazon's favor, we're going to see the power shift. And as we see that, we see the kind of fork in the road where Numenor could go left, could go right, and it ends up taking a hard right off a cliff's edge and into the ocean. So let's move on to that, and I'd love to get your thoughts. Obviously, we've just had a brand new article today from comicbook.com with Tristan Cravell talking about his portrayal of Pharazon. What are your thoughts about what we've heard so far about how they're portraying Pharazon, Gravell's own statements about it? How do you think they're approaching his character?
I have to say, actually, one of the first things I actually said when I realised that we were going to get this section of time was, I hope they go with Pharazon as a more sympathetic character. And that seems to be entirely what they're doing. Because I've always felt that, Pharazon, as we've as we see him, I think it's in the Silmarillion, he's an awful man. He's a terrible person, and there's really very and you know, he has complexities, sure, but a lot of his character and how bad it is just kind of floods over the whole philosophical question of what he's actually doing and why he's doing it. So I'm really excited to hear Tristan Gravel say things like, well, why can't humans live forever? Why are we not allowed to go closer to Valinor? What is it about us that means that we are not allowed this, but the elves are? Because, and I've said this on Twitter before, the presence of immortal beings in your world that you can speak to and you know they are there brings the question of why do we have to die from a philosophical question into a political discussion that is necessary to have for multiple human civilizations. It's kind of it's like this necessary melding of religious discussion with political discussion. How are we going to deal with the fact that we exist in this reality where it does feel a lot like we are the lower, less cared for, less loved children of Eru or whatever. Like that is, and you can understand why they are experiencing that. And I am so much more excited about Numenor's plot and the plot of Pharazon's character and of Miriel's character and all of the rest if the spokesperson for that issue is a more nuanced, more interesting man than just, I'm an arsehole, I want power, give it to me, I hate the god, whatever. This article actually made me really excited. It made me really excited. Everything that he said was really interesting and really in depth. And he obviously has picked up this character in a much more thoughtful way than I had ever imagined somebody would. And I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to like Pharazon now. A little bit concerned by the increase of affection that Pharazon is going to get in my estimation now. But no, I'm really. You were talking about this kind of dichotomy between Miriel and Pharazon. I'm actually not entirely sure if it will be Miriel who will be his detractor in this situation, because I was thinking, because you know, we've heard things like Miriel will be giving this blessing of children, like new mothers, they'll get her blessing, which I cannot even think about too long because it makes me so emotional. But having that moment of Miriel actually having a moment where she's a new Queen Regent, she is getting in touch with people whose lives are so new and so precious, and she's feeling the preciousness of this world and this country that is around her. And I think she's going to, at least for a while, she's going to be pushed into the way of Pharazon's thinking, because you can understand where her position is as a monarch, wanting to protect her people, and then Galadriel is arriving like, hey, come to Middle-earth, help us with our stuff. I think they probably are going to do a kind of Tartalepyrian thing, but in micro, and have that whole situation.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about as well. You've made me think about a couple of things there. The first, I wanted to go back to the article, because I think one of the things you raised about, you know, how sympathetic is Pharazon going to be? And I think the bit that really interested me was right at the end of the article. And other people I know have focused on the bigger stuff he says, which is about, you know, this idea of mortality and why are we banned and all that. And I think that's really important. But as for his characterization, I think the most interesting bit at the end, he talked about when people look at the micro and macro of any situation, and he says, and some people can lose perspective of the macro, or they can lose perspective of the micro, and then all of a sudden altruism can creep in a very bad way, and all of a sudden you're doing things for the greater good. And at first that's fine because it's for the greater good, but then how far is too far? And he actually said something very similar at one of the Comic-Con Q&As, where he said, you know, he really cares about bettering his civilization, bettering his people, bettering Numenor's position in the world, which, for me, I completely agree with you. Pharazon in the book is very much the guy who, okay, he's a great general, but then basically what happens is, you know, he sees that Miriel's going to take power unless he does something, and so he forces her into marriage, he takes the scepter by force, and then from that point onwards, you know, it's kind of a real decline. The one high point being that he comes to Middle-earth to stop Sauron, but even then when he does that, he makes the tragic mistake of bringing him back because it's all about pride and about him being the king of men and not Sauron. So you have that whole kind of mustache twirling evil king vibes, whereas this, I think we're going to more get someone who is so hell-bent on creating the greater good that he's going to lose sight of what that's going to require and what that's going to do to people. And so I think that's a really good arc for the character. But then when we look at Miriel, one of the things I'm fascinated about is, do they have Miriel going to Middle-earth, which we know that they're going to, but do we have her going to Middle-earth, helping save people, and then becoming disillusioned with Middle-earth, like you say, because in the kind of Tartelperion sense, do the Númenorians lose a lot of soldiers in the war? Do they feel their mortality more keenly? Or is this the point where she says, well, if we're going to bleed and die for this continent, we're going to start setting up outposts? And is that where we start seeing in the show's timeline Numenor expanding and going from being visitors to Middle-earth to being colonizers and imperialists? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about whether it's Miriel or Pharazon who's really going to push for that imperial repositioning of Numenor.
Oh, I think certainly Pharazon will be the one who is pushing for like, I think probably they're both going to kind of be in a parallel with each other in terms of their opinion on how they should handle Middle-earth. Up until a point. I think they're both going to be... I think Miriel is going to waver. I think there's going to be moments where she's thinking differently, but I think in general, they're going to be quite parallel up to a very significant point where suddenly Miriel is going to realize they went fully off the deep end and it's too late for her to do anything about it. You've just given me this sudden flash of realization that Pelagia does not exist yet, and maybe I will have to see it be built, which is very... I don't even need to think about that right now.
It's too much.
It's too much to think about. That's my boy. It's such a lot to happen. The issue is it's so much to happen. The deforestation, the building of Pelagia, the building of Umbar, the differentiation, the kind of diverging of Numenorean culture entirely into the faithful and the king's men, and these two havens being built at either end. Are we going to get to the slavery part in this show? There's a lot of questions that I have about how quickly this is all going to happen, but I certainly think that in terms of the colonization, I think there is going to be, just as you said, I think they are going to have arrived. They're going to have fought this Adar guy, and then there is going to be a bit where Miriel returns victorious but with casualties, and then Pharazon convinces her, okay, if this is going to be an issue and it's going to be a continued issue, then we need to have a better handle on the situation. We need to have places of strength. We need to build more ships. We need to make the armada larger. Pharazon is definitely going to be the driving force behind all of that, but as of yet, I'm not entirely sure if Miriel... I'm actually wondering if they're going to go with the version of it where Miriel is kind of in love with Pharazon and marries him because of that.
So this is where I get on my hobby horse. Now, I have to admit I don't have many hobby horses about the race of men in general. I'm much more of a kind of, I spend my time thinking about elves and how pretty they are and how dramatic they are and what a mess they are. But when I think about Numenor, and I've said this on Twitter, and I got into some, I'm going to say, friendly disagreements with people. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'll say. I have absolutely no interest in them doing the forced marriage plot. I am fully willing to believe they could do it well, that they could do it tastefully, that however you want to call it, I'm sure they could do it. But I have absolutely no desire to see one of the few female rulers in Tolkien's Middle-earth and Legendarium lose her power as a result of a forced marriage. Now, if Pharazon takes power through, and we might talk about this later, through his use of the guilds, through his military experience, through political wrangling and manipulation. Great with that. And then if they end up marrying after that, I guess fine. But I just think it's so reductionist to have Miriel, who could be such an interesting and complex character, just lose her power because, she's forced into marriage by Pharazon. And I just think I trust the show a lot, but having lived through other fantasy adaptations in the last 10 years, naming no names, I don't think that's a plotline the show needs to do. I just don't think it adds anything. And I think, to actually name a name, because everyone will know what I'm talking about, I think Game of Thrones was at its best when it was about political power plays, negotiations, diplomacy, betrayals, manipulations, all of that. And it was at its worst when it was just about whether the violence was gendered or not. It was at its worst when it was just like, well, I guess they're dead, or, they've been, had violence committed upon them in a physical sense, so they've lost power. And I just think, I don't know if we need it, but you tell me if I'm way off base. Tell me if you think there's a way that the show could do it well.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't. The addition of it has no benefit to the story that they're trying to tell, which is of this kind of philosophical, political mess of a country that eventually spirals out of control until a very cataclysmic end. There is no benefit to having it be so. It's a grueling issue. It's a grueling situation, and it's kind of a plot hole for me, actually, in the actual story, because we've had this happen before, right? Like, in Númenorian history, a queen gets married, and then that man tries to take over after she's dead. I think after she's dead, but anyway, he takes control, and then they boot him out, and so severely that even despite the fact that he technically did rule for a while, he's struck from the histories. He's not considered a king. So if they've had it happen before, how is it that Miriel, as a queen, and knowing what we know about how queens and kings are viewed in Numenorean history, literally as their priests, they really are the only people with any religious power in this whole society, how is it that it's all right for Miriel to be so displanted? Transplanted? No. She's
displaced, I guess.
Displaced, that's the word I'm looking for. She's so displaced from this role, which is not just political, it is very emotional for a lot of people. I suppose and this is the thing, you don't need the marriage, because if you have Pharazon being this kind of image of standing up for the little people, standing up for humanity as a whole against this faithful dogma that is driving them to sacrifice their lives for elves over and over again, you don't need him to marry Miriel for him to have enough support to actually take over the whole place entirely. I could see a situation where, again, like this happened. It happened in multiple different ways in the appendices and in the not in the appendices, in the unfinished tales and all of that stuff. You could have a situation where Miriel, where it's kind of in the middle of the two, right? Like one of them says Miriel is in love with him and marries him, and then spirals out of control. The other one is he forces her into marriage. You could have the middle ground, which is they have a political marriage where Miriel is like, I need more power, and Pharazon is like, I can give you that. If we get married, then we can join our forces and we can make this better. I promise we will be partners in this situation, and then going from there. But his power does not need to rest on the actual situation as a whole, being that he's become king. It doesn't need to do that, and it makes it kind of worse if it is.
I was just going to add, I mean, you have basically kind of said exactly what I was thinking, that I think, well, maybe they won't do this, but I think it's the smart way to go, and I think from what I can tell, this is kind of what they're setting up, that Miriel is going to need Pharazon. I think he's going to have a lot of the social capital and the capital among the political class, because as we discussed on our guilds episode, I think it was last week, this idea that if Numenorian society is really about who holds the power in society, and Miriel goes away to Middle-earth and she says, all right, cousin Pharazon, you look after this, don't do anything too silly. And maybe he doesn't start that period of Miriel being in Middle-earth with a kind of evil plan, but he has more people saying to him, actually, we could redo with this, we could redo with that. And he starts seeing that, well, maybe my way of doing things is great. And then by the time Miriel gets back from Middle-earth, her position is so shaky. Maybe she chooses to marry or form an alliance with him, or maybe she realizes she simply doesn't have any other choice. Maybe her choice is society is going to collapse, or we're going to have a kind of civil unrest if I try and keep handling this myself. Or I can bring Pharazon in, and maybe she thinks, well, I can bring him into the fold, keep him under my wing, keep him under watch, and use him. But Pharazon's too canny. He's too smart a political operator. And so maybe by the end of Season 2, Season 3, what we actually end up with is Pharazon kind of not doing that light switch moment where 1 minute he's not in power, the next minute he's not. But it's more like, boiling a frog. Miriel doesn't realize she's in trouble until far too late, until she realizes that she's in the throne room listening to counselors and courtiers, and they're looking to Pharazon for answers, not to her. And so I think that might be the way they go with it.
Yeah, no, I really agree. I think, and especially it does feel like it's being set up that way, like you said, because there was a discussion, I think it was actually in this article, where Pharazon says, she's a new queen, her father is ill, and his name is Tar Palantir. He started being called in Zulban or something like that, in Adunaic, which is a sure sign of a king going against the Valar or whatever. So she's very new to this. This is a very new situation for her. She is in a position of great social upheaval. And for a war to then insert itself into that situation, it probably makes her position even more shaky than before. And then, this was ages ago actually, I think it was actually Fellowship of Fans, they were talking about how there's going to be a scene where Miriel leaves to go and fight in Middle-earth, and leaves Pharazon behind. And then, whilst she's gone, he's doing all of his political machinations. He's figuring out how to get all of the guilds on his side, and that just kind of seems like how it's going to turn out. Yeah. Especially because Elendil is also not there, so he's also not there to do anything about it.
Well, you have perfectly segued us, because I've realised we've spent a good 20-25 minutes talking about Pharazon and Miriel, and, there is absolutely no way I could have you on the show talk about Numenor and us not talk about your well, maybe I'm presuming, but, some of your favourite people, I think, in the show, which is, of course, the House of Elendil, Isildur, and hopefully at some point, the Son of the Sun, worst name in all of Tolkien, maybe after Teleporno.
I'm gonna bite you.
I know, I'm sorry, that was bait, I apologise for that.
But yes, I like them just a little bit.
Yes, let's talk about the House of Elendil, and I'll just give you the kind of 30,000-foot question, and then you go wherever you feel. What is it you want to see from Elendil, Isildur, the rest of the boys in the show? What is it that you want to see, their role, their journey, their purpose, and maybe even their kind of emotional journey? What are you looking for from the show?
Rings of Power have offered me a vision of something I never even thought I would be allowed to have, which is the idea of Elendil having a crisis of faith. And I know it's going to end with him being more faithful, I understand that, but I'm so enamored of Elendil's crisis of faith. I'm so interested in this way that they seem to actually be almost paralleling Pharazon and Elendil in this interesting way. So they both have no wives, or at least we haven't seen any wife for Pharazon. We know that Elendil recently lost his wife. And they both have children who are a little bit hard to control, a little bit difficult. Their family life is obviously not particularly cozy or comfortable at the moment. And whilst obviously Pharazon is already pretty far down this road, I imagine, away from being faithful, Elendil, like Lloyd Owen was talking about how he's just trying to find a calm port in a storm, away from this faithful battle that he's have been trying to fight, I imagine, in the political sphere for such a long time, and he's moving towards the capital, which I'm really interested in, very excited about seeing how that will shift and change. I have a scene that I have created in my mind of Pharazon and Elendil having this discussion with each other of Pharazon, of them, they start by talking about, the losses of both of their partners, and then they move on to this discussion of faithful versus not faithful, and Elendil is confused and wavering, and Pharazon is powerful and charismatic, and he says things like, "But why did Eru take your wife? Why did she? Do you want to ask him? Shouldn't we be able to go and ask why that happened? Shouldn't we ask in general why we have to suffer these losses?" And Elendil not being able to say anything, and then the scene cuts, and I have it indelibly marked in my mind. I'm very excited about that whole thread, and I love the idea of paralleling Pharazon and Elendil, despite the fact that eventually Elendil certainly will diverge away. We'll get to that, but I want to see him really struggle. I want to see him struggle with this whole concept, and then I want them to believably make me think that he will actually go to the faithful side. I want to see why he did this. I want to know, and Lloyd Owen has been really knocking it out of the park for me. He keeps saying these things. He said, "Oh well," one of the first things I ever heard him talk about was how Numenor is kind of this Byzantium, and I was like, nobody ever talks about the Byzantium connection. He didn't talk about Egypt, but that's fine. It's fine. The Byzantium part is great. And so he kept discussing, like, he really enjoyed. He did also talk about this one idea where one thing that he will talk to fans, and he says that they have this really intense attachment, this possession of Elendil's character, when really you don't know anything about him. And I found that so ballsy of him to say. Like, I'm so sorry for his Twitter mentions, I guess. I'm so sorry for what's going on his Instagram, I imagine, after saying something like that. But brave of you, bold of you, wonderful stuff. Yes, please take Elendil and then make him whoever you want him to be.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's this, something we have to remember about these Second Age characters, even the ones who are major players in the Second Age. We mostly get a timeline of their lives. We don't get what were they thinking in this moment? Why did they choose to do that? Elendil, I suppose we get some interesting conversations with his father in the Silmarillion, but really we only get those conversations once the downfall is imminent and they're talking about what to do. But we don't really know whether, Elendil's always aggrieved with his father's position on this. We don't know how he thought about Miriel or Pharazon, or we obviously know he's a friend to the elves, but beyond that we know very little. And I think one of the interesting things we're going to get both with Elendil, and I'm actually probably even more interested in Isildur's journey, is, are there the seeds of his fateful decision from the beginning? Is this a young man who maybe is so trying to find his place in the world and so trying to find that definition, which I feel like we've heard Lloyd Owen talk about. I don't know if Maxim Baldry, who's playing Isildur, has talked about it, but this idea that Isildur, without his mother and with his father being this very kind of casting a long shadow, where is Isildur fitting into this? So I think there's a really interesting opportunity for the show to explain how we get these characters to the Battle of the Last Alliance, but not only how we get them there, what gets them there, what is the driving force that brings them to that point.
See, so this actually nicely walks into me talking about Anarion, which is exactly where I wanted to be.
Yes.
And is certainly the most tense little worm in my gut of worry about the show, because so we discussed, like, how does Isildur get to where he is, all right? And I know you really enjoy on Twitter every time I talk about Anarion being like, oh, what, the guy who got his head knocked on and died? Yeah, you really enjoy talking. I know.
Listen,
and
that's
it's a funny
all we know about him. All I know about Anarion is he gets bonked on the head by a rock. That's all I know.
Then let me tell you everything about Anarion. Anarion is one of the most vital pieces of this puzzle for the transition between the Second Age to the Third Age, and for Gondor as a whole. His existence describes so much that is unique about Gondor and Arnor as kingdoms that have come out of this weird refugee destruction of a city situation. So we start off. The fact that Anarion and Isildur rule together without any... It is so... It's such an important part, because there's no conflict. It's not like they fought to do this. They simply arrived and decided, despite Anarion being the younger, it's not like they're twins or something. They decided we're going to rule together. And then they did. For 100 years or so, they built this kingdom by themselves. They built their separate fortresses, but then they built Osgiliath together. They ruled from Osgiliath together. And then Anarion dies. And Isildur takes the ring after that. Anarion is dead. He is killed throughout this whole conflict. Isildur takes the ring after that. And then, afterwards, he goes to Minas Tirith and plants the white tree in memory of his brother. It's very poignant. And then he just leaves. He's not able to rule this country without his brother. He's not emotionally down to rule this country without his brother. He takes his brother's son aside, teaches him everything he knows, and then he's going to go to Arnor. There is no knowledge that we have that Isildur was ever going to claim the whole kingship as Elendil did. The death of Isildur's brother was so impactful to Isildur himself, and creates the whole situation that we come to because he has to leave, because he is, and I would posit that that's one of the major reasons he takes the ring in the first place, is this massive loss that he suffered. And I am a little bit concerned about the fact that Anarion just kind of seems to not be here. There was a recent leak, so there have been a few leaks. So the first thing we got about Anarion was this leak by Fellowship of the Fans that he was going to be a child, which I immediately was very irritated by, because again, if he's going to be this important person to Isildur, that doesn't really track, I suppose. Then the actress who plays Iarion, Emma Hovarth, she said she's the baby of the family, which then puts her behind Anarion. Okay, so Anarion is actually the middle child. And then we got a release that said Anarion is actually off somewhere. He's off looking, he's somewhere else. And it seemed initially that he was in Middle Earth, which I have to say I was so excited by. I was so thrilled with the idea of Anarion being the first of the brothers to actually have a kind of emotional connection to Middle Earth, to live there, to understand what they're going to be doing there, and to actually be the driving force behind understanding things like, well, Numenorian effects on Middle Earth are complex to bad, or maybe just bad, the effects of Numenorian colonization on Middle Earth. And then last thing we got was that actually no, he's actually on Numenor. He's just gone somewhere west of Numenor to find these little societies, these like little isolated apparently societies that are faithful. He's gone to find the faithful on which I'm not particularly into, but anyway.
Well, here's something I've wondered. I actually had the same thought about you, and firstly, let me say that was a fantastic explainer for people on why Anarion's important, because although I do joke about it, I do very much recognise importance, but I think you've put it far better than I ever could, and that emotional connection between him and his brother, and how, it's almost like Isildur first loses his home in Numenor, and maybe in the show he's going to lose a sister in that as well, so doubly devastating. Then he's going to lose his brother, who he's, as you said, pretty much joined at the hip with, or joined at the city with, I guess. And then he's going to lose his father, leaving him at the point where all he has to show for it is this ring and the victory over his enemy, who has been the architect of all his family dying and his home dying. So I think that's a really interesting angle. With Anarion, I do wonder, and I know we've only had these leaks and rumours, we know they're going with the guilds existing in the show, but the actual only canonical guild in Numenor was the Guild of Venturers. Now, we don't really know how long that lasted kind of post Aldarion, But what I would really love is if Anarion was involved in some way in that sort of society. He was going out exploring maybe undiscovered parts of Middle-earth, whether it's the kind of Southlands or the Far East or wherever it might be. And so while Isildur's first experience in Middle-earth is going to be when he goes over with Miriel and Galadriel to fight, Anarion's first experience is one of discovery and joy and empathy and openness and learning. And so in many ways, I would love something like that, where the two brothers had such different experiences of Middle-earth at first, but then in the kind of aftermath of the downfall and the Akalabeth, you have them coming together to almost protect their whole history and protect their whole identity and somehow keep the dream of the Edain, of the faithful men alive. And so I think now, I mean, admittedly, I wonder how much time they're going to have for that, given the scale of the story they're trying to tell. But I think as long as they introduce Anarion properly at the start of Season 2, that's still a 4-season arc they've got to give to him, right? So I feel like there's still some room there.
Well, apparently he is going to be in this season as well. Those are the rumors.
But are we going to see him?
Well, no, like he's going to be there visually, apparently. Apparently we're going to see him visually. As far as I can tell, that has been the release that are going. But yes, I am a little concerned that we're not going to see him in this. So long as he's not Halbrand, I'll be fine. So long as he's not Halbrand.
Anything
but he's Halbrand. So yes, I mean that is the deepest desire of my heart for Anarion. If he actually has an emotional connection and understanding of Middle-earth already, I would be so happy. That would just, because again, Anarion is also the brother that stayed. Anarion is the brother that when Isildur went off to get his dad, who had landed all the way up in the top of the map, Isildur left to go and find Elendil and to create the Last Alliance. Anarion stayed. It was 3 years of time that he sat in Osgiliath and rebuffed attacks from Mordor, and he just sat there. And let me just talk about stewards for just like 5 seconds. The thing about Anarion is that the fact that he stayed, the fact that he is this archetype both of loss and of love between himself and Isildur, and that then kind of strangely morphed into the situation where the kings of Gondor almost felt like they were missing something, and so they created this house of stewards. Well, the stewards, it's a very complicated history, but the fact that Gondor has always kind of been ruled in this two-way street, and the way that the steward's actual Quenya name actually means friend of the king. But friend is in love, friend is in affection. So it's always been this way. Gondor has been always built on the concept of affection and love between two people to support and nurture a kingdom between each other. So the idea of Anarion first both being the brother that arrived in Middle-earth first, and that then was the brother that stayed and sat there, very Denethor-esque. He withstood this terrible tide of evil for such a long time until Isildur came back. It would be perfect. I'm worried that's not going to be what's going to happen now, and I need to not get too attached to that very, very good idea of Anarion and characterization of Anarion. I need to withdraw slightly from it and calm myself down about how excited I would be if that was the case. But if that's how it show it, then this show will be the best piece of Lord of the Rings media for me ever. I got in trouble on Twitter. You probably saw this, right? I posted this tweet that said something along the lines of, okay, Rings of Power is better for me than the films now. Forgetting, of course, that other people other than people who know I hate the films could see it. So I got in a bit of trouble, but no, I mean it's earnest, it's honest. This is the philosophy and the culture and the people and the individual stories of love and complex connection and withstanding of evil is what I really enjoyed about the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
and it wasn't really there in the films, and it seems to be here in the Rings of Power, so it's probably going to be something I most enjoy about.
Yeah, do you know, that's so interesting, because I remember when you tweeted that, and I did kind of just stand back and watch, your house go up in flames as you tweeted that out. But one of the things I think I said to you at the time was, I think in 5 years that won't be an unpopular opinion, or at least it will be an opinion that a lot of people hold, because, and I only started to think this, even though I loved everything I was seeing. I created a whole Twitter account to talk about this show because I was so excited and had nothing else to do with it. But the thing that's really convinced me that the show is doing something much deeper with Tolkien is hearing all the actors talk in interviews and at Comic-Con. Just to give a few examples, Gil-galad, Benjamin Walker, talking about how do elves go on after seeing everyone they love die over and over again. How do they keep on going after they keep losing over and over again? And how do they learn to fall in love again? And he used this phrase, they do learn, but they learn to fall in love with Middle-earth, which I just think is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And then we have Elrond's actor talking about this is the closest Elrond is ever going to be to the choice he and his brother made, and that he is fundamentally at this point nothing but an orphan. And what does that do for him? And then you've got Lloyd Owen, as we've already talked about, talking about, his internal struggle, his struggle with his children, the fact he's lost his wife. I'm not even going to talk about the fact he's wearing a ring that says safe return in Quenya, which he got from his wife, because that makes me want to cry. It's so beautiful.
It does, yeah.
I just think... I just think the show is engaging with the source material, and it may be due to the showrunner's own faith or their own reading of Tolkien, but they're really engaging with it. My big worry before the show came out, when we knew they were doing the Second Age, was how do you do the Second Age story without being a bit, kind of nodding a wink to the audience about the gods existing? Because, Jackson, I don't think this was a failing of his, it just wasn't part of the story. He never really had to address the existence of the Valar, the existence of Eru, the fact that gods are not a debatable or even, kind of article of faith within Middle-earth. They are just simply something that was there, and they still impact the world, and they have impacted the world. And I was worried that the show was just going to say, do you know what? That's going to be a bit difficult a pill for the audience to swallow. But then, we've seen Gil-galad with his costume having references to Manwë and Varda. We've seen Numenor having statues to, we think, possibly Ulmo and maybe other Valar. We've heard about these elven shrines and all these other things. And so I'm very impressed that the show is willing to take this risk, because I do think it's a risk. I think some non-book readers might come into this and be like, hang on, there are gods in Middle-earth, and, they're like demigods. It's like the Nordic pantheon or the Greek pantheon, and there's an island kingdom and a what now, and Elrond's mother was a bird and his dad was a star. There's a lot of stuff that the non-book reader could easily blanch at. So, I agree with you. I think there's an appetite and an aspiration to do something deeper here. Whether they pull it off, I don't know, but it definitely seems like they're attempting that.
Yeah, exactly. Perhaps it was just this article today, because this article today about Pharazon was the first real clear. We've had something about this before, but it was the very clearest indication that we are going to get philosophy. This is going to be about human philosophy and the philosophy of how they deal with this situation. How do you deal with living in a world where you are mortal, and you know you're mortal, and all of your friends and your family and everybody you love are all mortal and they have to die, when there are other creatures in this world that you can talk to who don't die? How do you deal with that? How do you experience that? And how do you live that life? And what does it make you do? And how sympathetic do you feel to their problems, and how sympathetic I'll be very interested to figure out how sympathetic the actual audience are going to be watching this show. It will be very interesting to me to see how this is all going to shake out in terms of how people view the Valar. Because, I have a Twitter that is full of entirely controversial takes, as far as I can tell. I'm always making my little stand about how terrible Gandalf is and how Galadriel's a bad person, etc., blah, blah, blah. Book readers, they get this very measured understanding of how all of the characters experience the world and all of the wisdoms of Galadriel, etc., and all of the wisdoms of Gandalf. But if you see it in this kind of stark perspective of a show, especially of a show which is going to go into depth of the personalities of all these people, I would be very interested to see if there isn't actually a kind of, let's say, an interesting upsurge of also anti-elf sentiment in the general population of the real world. I would be very interested to see how that'll shake out. And that's exciting to me, and that's the philosophy that I wanted to happen.
Yeah, I think and I'll return briefly to the last thing I wanted to talk about, Numenor, in a second, but I just want to say you've made me think of something, which is I've kept thinking about the original characters of Arondir and Bronwyn as the kind of Andreth and Aignor stand-in, so that we can have that kind of philosophical, theological debate about the gift of men versus the immortality of elves, what that all means, and also discuss this idea of, can these two races love each other? Is it possible for that love to be real and exist when one of you is tied to this earth, with serial longevity, if you don't want to say immortality, and the other is going to have a mortal life and then go beyond the walls of Arda and blah-de-blah. But I think it's also interesting that Bronwyn and the other men of Middle-earth may, like you say, actually make people think, well, the men who became ringwraiths, they were only looking at the situation and saying, how else is our lot going to improve? The elves are never going to help us out. They're never going to stop us dying. They're never going to, in any way trade their grace for ours. And then someone comes along who says, actually, I've got a solution for you. And it just requires that you wear this little ring and everything's going to be quite all right for you. So I do wonder whether we're going to get this from both the Numenorean perspective and the Men of Middle-earth. And obviously, Tolkien's writing on the Men of Middle-earth of the Second Age is basically just, well, they had a bad time. That's all I've got to tell you. So I think there's a lot of room to explore, isn't there?
Had a real bad time. But yeah, I entirely agree. I'm very interested. I'm very interested to see how we're going to experience the pre-Numenorians interacting with Numenorians, because apparently that's going to happen. I'm very intrigued with that and how that's going to work out. I would like to see how they express that relationship, especially. I wish they would stop calling it Southlands. I am at my wit's end. Are we looking at Gondor, or are we looking at Harad, or is it south of somewhere else? Is it south of Erran Luin? In which case we're looking at.
Is it pre-Mordor?
Minhiraeth. Is it pre-Mordor? I need to know. They need to stop saying these things. Give me the actual place where we are, and then I'll be happy. Southlands is just so. Anyway.
Okay, so before we finish, because I know we're almost out of time, I do have one last Numenorean topic, and I actually don't think I know where you stand on this, because I don't think we've really talked about it on Twitter. We've talked maybe about one aspect of this, which is the names before. But how are you feeling about the two original characters, Eärien and Kemen? Now, I was initially kind of very, and I'll just give you my quick perspective, and then I'd love to hear your more in-depth one. I was initially very concerned about the two of them. I'm now a lot more reassured after Comic-Con and hearing their actors talk about it. I mean, I'm very reassured about the name Eärion's been given, and I think I have an idea what they're doing with those two characters. But how are you feeling about them? Do you think it's maybe going to be a waste of time? Do you think they're going to play a crucial role? How do you think about those two characters?
I've also similarly gone on a very up and down journey with my relationship to those characters. Kemen was such an out of left field addition to this. I'm very interested in the idea of Pharazon having a bit of a privileged, a kind of rich kid child, who's a little bit of a lout, but who's also going to maybe be in a romantic relationship with Eärien. An interesting choice. I'm not inspired by it. I'm not very, very excited. I do like the addition of Pharazon having a son. I like the idea of him having children and him being even more attached to the workings of Numenor and its future and all of that. And Kemen's funny. He's funny as an addition. But Eärien, I have a very complicated relationship with Eärien. Her addition again. I have a struggle with her addition being that she complicates the relationship between Isildur and Anarion, right? Like she
She's
feels like
getting in the way of your boys, is what you're saying.
Well, it's more she's acting like, she talks about this. Emma Hovarth talks about how Iarion has kind of become a kind of mother figure to because of the loss of their mother, despite the fact that she's the youngest child. And I understand making that, but I do feel like Anarion could have fulfilled that role if they'd wanted that situation to be the case. And I don't know. I mean,
so I'll give you my brief take on Eowyn, which is that I think Emma Horvath's been talking about that probably because that's the part of her plot she can talk about. You know, in the same way we've heard other characters talk about things, and you're like, really, that's the center of your character's plot for the Second Age? And then you realize, well, actually, they can't talk about the actual plot because they're keeping most of that secret. I think that Eowyn's plot is going to be her finding herself more and more involved in the political side of Numenor. And I think while, you know, Isildur and Anarion are going to cover that more martial element and Elendil's going to have that more lordly role, I think Eowyn is going to be trying to find her place. Now, I think the whole architect thing, my theory, and I've said this for a while, and I saw a couple of other people on Twitter say this as well, I am now 110 or 20% convinced that she is going to be the one that designs the temple which Sauron has built when he comes to Numenor. That is my number one prediction. Call me back in 4 years, but I think that's where her story's going, and I think she's going to end up going down with the ship, so to speak. I think she is going to stay in Numenor because she sees her place and her purpose there, and I think in that way, the Anarion-Isildur relationship will become more natural because I think she's going to detach herself more from her family. And I don't think she's going to attach herself to Kemen because I tend to think Kemen's going to be a bit of a wet fish. But I think she's going to attach herself to Pharazon and Miriel and try to attach herself to whichever one she thinks is on the ascendancy. And I think when she sees Pharazon on the ascendancy, she's going to try and attach herself to him. And so I wonder whether that's just going to be another angle for the show to look at the internal society and politics of Numenor. But that's just my idea.
I think probably you are right. I admittedly, I've just realised that the fact that she is there means that I will be allowed to have scenes which maybe are within the Architects' Fellow Hall, within the Builders' Hall, talking to other builders, and maybe she has a mentor. Maybe I get to see libraries. Maybe I get to see that. So actually, I'm fine. Great character, Anarion, 100%. My favorite character, maybe. But I do agree with you. I think the thing about Iarion, that I am most interested in is just the way that she will complicate the whole family dynamic. Now that I think about it, I am interested in the idea of Elendil having these three incredibly. I mean, it's quite funny, you know. If you have Anarion's literally just bugged off to the other end of the island, he doesn't even know where he is at the moment. Yeah. Isildur is out being some kind of lout. He's running around. He should be on a ship. He's not on a ship. Doesn't know where he is. And Iarion is rapidly climbing her way up through the social political sphere and Numenor's version of university, and then she keeps coming home saying really worrying things every now and then, like, well, I was designing the the temple that's going to be at the top of the Meltop. All of that. I think I am intrigued by that angle of it, and I think now I think about it, I think Kemen's going to get a redemption arc. I think Kemen, because Kemen has this, he's wearing this very interesting get-up, which me and Kaz, Paul from the Silly Marillion, we both were like, that's Elrond. That has to be Elrond, because he's wearing this pattern that has both Luthien's sigil in it and I think either Earendil's or one of the other noble houses of the elves. It looked exactly like that should be Elrond, and he's wearing this like really interesting. But if he's wearing elven designs, Kevin could kind of be. I think obviously he's going to start out being a little bit dumb and a little bit like lackluster, not really caring about the situation and enjoying the way the world is as it is. But as it starts going downhill, I think maybe Kemen's going to get a bit of a redemption, and he's going to start trying to draw Erran away from whatever influence his father has over her, maybe, and he's going to slowly drift away from his father, maybe drift back towards Elendil. Maybe Pharazon and Elendil are just going to swap children. It's going to be very funny if that happens. If Iarion has multiple scenes where, because you know what, that's actually true. One of the things that Fellowship of the Fans also released on was that there was going to be a scene where Pharazon is actually at a dinner with Kemen and Iarion, and he says something. He says something about the running of the country or something, and then Kemen begins to speak, and he says, "Not you. I know what your opinion is. What's Iarion's opinion?" So I guess Iarion has an opinion that Pharazon wants. I think he must be right. I think you're probably right. Iarion's going to go full dark side. Very excited. Excited for Erran to go full dark.
I mean, I think what you might end up with is that as you say, they both kind of move. They start at opposite ends. Erran coming from this place of the faithful, of being Elendil's daughter, and Kemen starting as Pharazon's son. But actually, Pharazon's actually said something very interesting. He said that Pharazon walks round Numenor, or something to this effect. He says Pharazon walks around and he looks at the buildings and the statues and he thinks, what would my legacy look like carved in stone? And so it's very clear to me he doesn't think of Kemen as his legacy.
Yeah.
And so I wonder to what extent, as Pharazon becomes more and more about this larger legacy, Kemen goes, well, if I'm, never going to get father's approval, so to speak, I'm going to go and do something completely different. Now, I do think both Kemen and Erran are probably going to take an unfortunate, unplanned scuba diving trip in about 4 years.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think they could be interesting characters to look at. Now, we're pretty much out of time, but I've decided now that I have guests on this show, I want to do a fun little game. And I'm probably going to change the game depending on who comes on, but I would like to play this game with you. I'm going to name a character, and you are going to tell me whether they are going to become a ring wraith or not. Does that make sense?
Oh, fun. Yes.
Okay.
Fun, yeah.
Okay, we'll start with someone who you probably don't feel strongly about. Halbrand.
I actually don't think he's going to become a ring wraith, because I think he's going to be Sauron.
Oh my god, there's a take. We're going to have to discuss that another time, but you've said it now.
Yeah.
You've said it now, so everyone's got that on the record.
No. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and then my last two, we've already talked about them, and I think I know your answer, but Kemen and Earion, either of those going to become ring wraiths?
I would love Erran to become a ring wraith. I want that so badly. That would be the best thing ever if Erran became a ring wraith. I think if Kemen doesn't get a redemption arc, he will be a ring wraith. I think if Kemen doesn't get a redemption arc, definitely fully to the opposite side, he's going to become a ring wraith. Earion, I want her to be, but I don't think she will be.
Yeah, the trouble is that we know 3 of the ring wraiths have to be Númenorians. So we know the show needs to introduce us to 3 Númenorians, probably by season 2 or 3, that are possible candidates. But the other problem is it weird if one of the ring wraiths is related to Isildur and Elendil? I don't know if I'd find that really weird, that it turns out that one of the House of Elendil is also a ring wraith. I don't know how I'd feel about that at all, actually. I love the idea for Eärendil's character, but I don't know if I love that for the House of Elendil.
Well, I've been desensitized to the House of Elendil being ring wraiths, because in Shadow of Mordor and in Shadow of War they make Isildur a ring wraith, and I
oh no.
I can't think about it too long. I can't think about it too long.
No.
All the fabric of time and space will break around me because of how much that fucks with the timeline. But the point is that I actually think it would slap. Honestly, briefly, to just really small amount of talking about Lord of the Rings Online. In Lord of the Rings Online, he's not an actual ring wraith, but he's kind of a wraith. Iana is a wraith. He becomes this terrifying wraith who then keeps Angmar for the Witch King. He becomes like the Lord of Angmar for a while, and he's like one of your major antagonists throughout the whole game, and it's so cool. It works so well, and it's also crushing. It's like the most emotionally breaking moment for me in the whole of Lord of the Rings Online canon. But I loved it. It slapped so much. It was a really good understanding of what happened to Iana after we fight the Witch King similarly. But yeah, so I would 100% be for the idea of like an evil line of Elendil haunting the rest of their people for the rest of the... If Iarion is the Witch King, I'll be out of my mind. I'll be so happy. I want Iarion to be the Witch King so badly. That would be great.
I love this. I love this. Just as we're finishing, you're throwing your most hot takes out there. This is actually perfect, because this is what I want. I want people to be just finishing the episode, and then all they hear is Eärien being the Witch King would slap, and then they just have to go out in rage for the rest of their day. So that's perfect for me.
Well, you're welcome. I have more if you want them, but I'll stop there.
I think we might have to save that for your return appearance. Well, luckily, I think once the show, after we get a few episodes or at some point after the season ends, I'm going to have you back, because we're going to have to do a post-mortem on Numenor Season 1 and see where were your hopes met, where were they dashed, and how did you feel when Anarion never showed his face across all 8 episodes? Because I'm telling you, he's not showing up.
There's going to be a before Rings of Power person who I was, and an after Rings of Power person who I will be. It is completely up to the dice whether or not that is a better or worse person. How much of a character change will this actually have this show affect me? But we will see. We'll see. And it will be very fun to listen to this episode just before I come on to the next time I am invited. And
yes.
That'll be surreal. Wow.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're all going to find ourselves looking at our lives and our views on Tolkien and Lord of the Rings in, as you said, a pre-Rings of Power and a post-Rings of Power. And I think some of our fundamental beliefs may get strengthened, and others may get shaken, and others we may find burning in a pile on the floor. So it'll be a traumatic time for all of us, no doubt. But before we finish, I just want to say thank you so much, Erran, for coming on the show. It has been an absolute pleasure. Definitely my most chaotic episode, but also my most enjoyable and filled with laughter. Please tell the audience where they can find you on Twitter and what they can expect from your Twitter account as a fair warning.
It's a very good shout. I am Lesbian Boromir, at Lesbian Boromir on Twitter, and I post about Boromir and Denethor and how they're great characters, and I love both of them. And I often post about how much I am irritated with Peter Jackson, to put it mildly. I often post about how Gandalf is bad and how Galadriel is bad and how Faramir is bad. And if you want to know about that, go ahead and come and be angry with me in my Twitters. That's fine. I live for the discussion and arguments.
I mean, that sounds like fantastic fun. And I would also like to say that for legal purposes, all of the views expressed by Erran on this show do not represent my own, and I cannot be held liable for them. So
legal purposes. Yeah, no, don't come to Harry for your "how dare you be mean to Faramir" takes. Come to me. I'll take them. I'll welcome you into my arms.
Exactly. Well, brilliant. Thank you, Erran, so much for coming on, and we can't wait to have you next time. Well, listeners, I greatly appreciate you listening to that extra long episode. I hope you enjoyed our rambling discussion as we really got under the skin of all things Númenor. Let us know in the comments what you'd like to see from Miriel and Pharazon and the rest of the Númenorian ensemble. And thank you once again to Erran coming on the show, and for managing to deliver so much insight about this topic, whilst also keeping it light and keeping me laughing all the way through our conversation. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. As it's the weekend, we won't have an episode tomorrow, but I'll be back on Monday with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namaria.